Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
I said, I'm not guilty. And the attorney said, good, and we'll go to trial.
The forgotten man in the Robert Marshall murder case, sentenced to 30 years behind bars. But should he ever have gone to prison? And should he still be there after 17 years? Now even his trial judge is saying it is time to let him out. The troubling tale of Bobby Cumber, the troubling turns of mandatory sentencing. Up next on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
He could have been home free 17 years ago. It was the plea bargain of the century. But when Bobby Cumber turned it down, he went to trial, was convicted of conspiracy to murder Maria Marshall, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. I'm Raymond Brown, and our focus today, the forgotten man in the Robert Marshall murder case, and the mandatory sentencing laws that have kept him imprisoned for all these years. We'll talk to New Jersey's public defender about why those laws should go, to a county prosecutor about why they should be kept, and to a retired Superior Court judge about whether they really do usurp judicial discretion. But first, here's Sandy King to fill us in on the strange, sad saga of Bobby Cumber.
Raymond, Robert Marshall, on death row for nearly 18 years in the murder of his wife, could be the first person executed here since the death penalty's reinstatement more than 20 years ago. And that may come as no surprise if you followed his high-profile killing-for-hire case over the last 2 decades. But chances are you have not heard of Bobby Cumber, a rather marginal figure in the Marshall murder who's always insisted he was innocent and who, 17 years ago, made a bad call that he's paid for dearly every day since.
Keep going. Take that one step at a time, one day at a time. Hoping one day somebody will do the right thing and send me home.
He's been hoping now for 17 years, and unless the governor commutes his sentence, he could be here for another 13. But Bobby Cumber's not the only one who thinks he should be out.
Well, I felt that it was not a just result.
Manuel Greenberg was the judge at his trial, now a voice in support of his release.
Cumber was a fellow who had minimal involvement in the murder.
That murder, one of New Jersey's most notorious, the killing for hire at a Parkway rest stop of Maria Marshall by her husband.
Robert O. Marshall, I sentence you to the punishment of death as required by law.
A country club couple whose bloody story made national headlines, a movie, a best-selling book.
He said what he really wanted to do was to get rid of his wife.
But while the admitted co-conspirator turned star witness, the accused and ultimately acquitted hitman, and the girlfriend who took the stand all shared the spotlight with Marshall.
I swear if there were a way that I could either do away or get rid of her.
Bobby Cumber was the man no one knew, the alleged go-between from Louisiana, against whom there was so little evidence, just a series of quick phone calls from Marshall, that Judge Greenberg initially dismissed the charges against him.
I read the grand jury transcript, and I conclude there's nothing in the grand jury transcript to indicate that Cumber knew there was going to be a murder.
But after Cumber filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Ocean County authorities, they appealed the dismissal, and an appellate court reinstated the charges.
They felt that the fact of all of those telephone calls was sufficient. The fact of the calls themselves was sufficient, that there was some evidence.
But with even Billy Wayne McKinnon, the state's own witness, who cut a deal for himself of only 18 months, saying Cumber never knew there was going to be a murder, the prosecution wasn't anxious for a trial.
So the state made an offer to him.
Good offer.
A good offer, I would say.
In fact, it was an unheard-of offer in a case involving conspiracy to murder. Plead guilty to one minor count, be sentenced to 1 year, time served, and Cumber would be free. How many times have you seen a deal that good when murder charges are pending?
Never.
Never. But Cumber still had hopes for his suit against Ocean, and he says he had an Air Force pension at stake. Besides, he didn't believe he could be convicted.
I said, I'm not guilty. And my attorney said, okay, fine, we'll go to trial.
But at trial, the prosecution introduced new evidence. An investigator who told the court that Cumber had told him he did know that what Marshall and McKinnon were plotting was the murder of Maria.
There was certainly no videotape, and I'm sure there was no signed statement. It was an investigator testifying from his notes or reports as to what he said that Cumber told him.
Testimony that turned out to be very effective.
Well, Cumber was convicted.
And once convicted, this hardware store clerk from Louisiana, who had never been arrested, never had so much as a driving violation, was on an inescapable road to decades in state prison. The same judge who had dismissed charges against you was forced to sentence you.
That's right.
To?
30 years.
I gave Mr. Cumber the minimum sentence that you could give, which was 30 years.
But when legislators set that mandatory sentence, was Bobby Cumber's the kind of case they had in mind?
When you look at all the other facts about what happened to whom and what didn't happen, it just seemed to me that the result was not a fair result, that he deserved some type of executive clemency.
But just days before she left office, despite Judge Greenberg's urging, Governor Whitman rejected Cumber's clemency petition.
Every time I turn around, they're denied.
And you don't understand why?
No.
But now, with the help of a public defender, Cumber, who is beset by health problems, who has a nearly perfect prison record but no visitors, is about to try again, hoping this governor may say yes.
I'm not guilty of this crime. I just want to go back to Louisiana and live out the rest of my life with my family.
And this time it will be up to Jim McGreevey. Cumber is seeking clemency again, and again Judge Greenberg's recommendation to set him free will be part of the package. Now, if he should be successful, Cumber would be headed home to Louisiana, where he has a wife and grown daughter. He talks to them every week on the phone, and apparently they've been waiting for him all this time, but at his request, they've never been to see him in prison. Cumber hasn't seen his family for more than 17 years.
Without clemency, Cumber will have to serve his full 30, thanks to state sentencing statutes that tied Judge Greenberg's hands. And it's those statutes we'll be talking about next. Not just the mandatories for murder, but for a range of crimes, including the mandatory sentences for drugs that have filled our jails and prisons. So stay with us.
I think the legislature made a good choice, making mandatory sentencing. This way it doesn't put the responsibility on the judge.
I think it would be good to take each case individually. I think that any time you disallow a judge to use his own discretion, that you do justice and injustice.
The judges, because they have the background to do what they do, they should be given the discretion to use their own judgment.
Mandatory sentencing is not fair in all cases. However, all judges would have their own discretion to use, and that wouldn't be fair to the criminals either.
I know of cases where people have been let out on parole and have gone on to murder other people.
But to be handcuffed by these draconian laws that allow for someone to be sentenced according to some law that was passed by a politician rather than the courts of law, I think it's a grave injustice that should be addressed.
But what do the experts think? Those judges and lawyers who work with mandatory sentencing every day. Well, that tends to depend on which side of the case or which side of the bench you happen to sit on. And so our distinguished panel includes a defense lawyer, New Jersey's Chief Public Defender Yvonne Seegers, a prosecutor, Monmouth County's First Assistant Bob Honaker, and someone who's had to hand down those mandatory sentences, retired Superior Court and Appellate Court Judge Isaiah Steinberg. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you, Raymond.
Let me start up in Newark with you, Judge Steinberg, in part because you're the wisest of us all, but also because I want to ask you this tough question. Your colleague, Judge Greenberg, who imposed sentence on Mr. Cumber, says that he felt it was an unjust sentence at the time he imposed it. That raises a question that I suspect most people don't think about every day, but does it raise a problem with justice when judges are required to hand down sentences that they don't feel in their experience are just?
I think as a general rule of thumb, the answer is yes. But you made a point earlier of dealing with mandatory sentences for murder and mandatory sentences for other crimes. And I think that in order to have respect out in the street, so to speak, I do think you have to have mandatory sentences for murders. Other crimes, there's always a problem and always not only a potential for injustice, but actual injustice when mandatory sentences are imposed on people who may not deserve them.
We're going to come
New York Rockefeller laws are a perfect example.
We're going to come to other offenses in a moment, but let me just for a moment stick with the Cumber case.
Okay.
So then, should we as citizens not be disturbed that in this particular case, whatever I might think, that the judge who handled the matter felt that a man is doing 30 years when in fact the just result should have been something less? Should we not be troubled by a system that produces that kind of anomaly?
Yeah, the answer has to be yes to that. And this case is really an anomaly because McKinnon, who was no question hired to kill, said that Cumber didn't know about the murder. McKinnon was allowed to walk because he turned state's evidence. He turned state's evidence and was really the only person to link Marshall to the crime. He fingered a guy named Thompson as the actual trigger man. Thompson was found not guilty by the jury. And here's Cumber, who certainly had a minimal role in this conspiracy, who was doing 30 years without parole. Now, obviously a jury found beyond a reasonable doubt and found unanimously that Cumber involvement was more than he's saying, because in order to be subjected to punishment under the murder statute, a jury had to be convinced unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew when he put Marshall and McKinnon together that the ultimate plot was to kill Maria Marshall. If one juror had a reasonable doubt as to that factor, there would have been a hung jury. If they all had a reasonable doubt, he would have been acquitted. So his involvement is more, but there's no question in my mind that a sentence of 30 years without parole for him, given his minimal involvement of putting the two together, is draconian.
Right. So it sounds like you have at least some question, and we know your colleague Judge Greenberg had a big one. Let me go to my good friend Bob Honaker, who's a fair guy, but I think says, or would have to say given other positions, that you're not uncomfortable with a result in which the sentencing judge says, I wouldn't do this knowing all I know, but I'm required to do so by the legislature.
I don't have a problem with it. I think that we're talking about a murder here. We're talking about a murder orchestrated by Robert Marshall, involving a number of different players. All of those players are responsible for the death of Maria Marshall. The penalties for the crime of murder have a mandatory minimum of at least 30 years imprisonment. Whether, as characterized by Judge Greenberg, who I have a great respect for, that it was a minimal role, it was still a part and development of the murder of Maria Marshall, and the consequence of 30 years, I don't think, is an improper penalty.
Now, is this because you think murder is different, or do you extend that view across the board?
I extend that view across the board to other crimes.
Let me come
well.
back to other crimes, because I want to talk to a person who is in charge of his lawyers. That is, Mr. Cumber is represented by your office, because you're not just a public defender, you're the public defender. So why should there be some concern from a societal point of view about this sentence he's serving?
To the extent, in whether it's this case or any case, Ray, where the judge loses complete discretion as to how an individual should be treated, that is a problem for all of us, whether it's this case or other cases, such as the drug laws, which the judge referred to earlier. And I think that it is a problem for us to look at these mandatory minimums and not recognize that a judge's inability to look at the crime and the individual involved and not be able to use his or her discretion.
Let me do something I'd never get away with in private life, and that's interrupt you. In fact, the reason that we have, or one of the principal reasons that we have mandatory sentencing, is that there were criticisms both of the federal system and the state system that the poor, people of color, and those people who were unpopular or pariahs in society were not being sentenced the same way as those of wealth and power. And the purpose of mandatory sentencing was to even that out.
Sure,
why is it that you're not an advocate then of mandatory
Well,
sentencing?
because the practical implications that have happened as a result of these laws, particularly the drug laws, has resulted in the disproportionate number of minorities being incarcerated for mandatory minimum sentences. That these laws, as applied, have had such a negative impact on these communities, and all of the social ilks that result as a result of them. We have other issues such as single parents, fatherless homes, and that burdens our community as a whole.
All right. Judge, you started out by complicating my mission today by distinguishing murder from other kinds of cases. So let me know what it is that you find objectionable about taking discretion away from judges in non-murder cases.
Well, the public defender hit on one. You've got a disproportionate amount of minorities who are saddled with these mandatory sentences. You think there aren't kids in Cherry Hill or Voorhees or Somerville selling drugs, but they don't do it in the open. They do it in the sanctity of their home, and they don't get caught. You get, and I said earlier, New York's Rockefeller laws are a perfect example of draconian results. In New Jersey, for example, if you sell 1/2 ounce or more, between 1/2 ounce and 5 ounces, it's a second-degree crime. And the potential sentence is between 5 and 10 years in prison, no more of 5, which can be ordered to be served without parole. In New York, that's a 15-year-to-life sentence, 15 years without parole for a first offender who's never been arrested before. We have cases like that in New Jersey with people who get caught up in the school zone law. The school zone law is laudable, it's wonderful, it has a wonderful purpose if it were confined to school property.
And by the school zone law, you mean a law that enhances penalties if your offense is within a certain distance of a school?
Certainly, okay. Yeah, a mandatory period of parole and eligibility of in cocaine or heroin or some of the major drugs, it's 3 years without parole unless the prosecutor is willing to waive off.
Let's see what Bob Heinecker has to say about that.
I'm wondering what the judge would feel about it. When you look at the progression of mandatory minimums, we look at the crimes of murder, we look at violent crimes. In New Jersey now we have the No Early Release Act, which requires at least 85% imprisonment for individuals who commit violent crimes, cause injury to a person. I don't think anybody has a problem with sending violent criminals to jail. For people who deal drugs or possess drugs with intent to distribute in the schools,
wouldn't you trust Judge Steinberg to send a violent criminal to jail?
Here's the reason, two reasons why we have mandatory minimums. Number one, judges were returning violent criminals and drug dealers back into the street. The community was saying, hey, I thought this guy just was arrested and now he's back on the street again. The second thing is the parole laws in New Jersey allowed somebody who was convicted of 20 years to be released.
So then the answer is you don't trust Judge Steinberg to exercise discretion effectively and send violent criminals to jail when they should go and give sentences that are appropriate to the conduct of the person
I think it is more equitable to judge it by the crime and the type of crime that is committed.
I've never known you to evade a question before. Do you trust Judge Steinberg
I trust the judiciary, because the judiciary, in order to have the criminal justice system work, it has to be good judges, good prosecutors, and good public defenders. So I trust judges' discretion. However, when we're talking about a particular type of crime, violent crime and dealing drugs within schools, I have no problem problem in removing the judge's discretion.
Well, you have what you've said is you trust the judge's discretion, but on the backhand you say, but take it away, and don't look at the individual background. Of course, you have a particular person who's charged with a violent offense. It may be an aberration. A woman who's one incident, no prior record, and she may be, taken off the street for 85%, a long period of time, leaving behind family and children. And where's the equity?
Let's take a look at the nature of the crime. For someone going to be sent to jail for a mandatory minimum, they have committed a serious crime.
This may be true.
In New Jersey, a serious crime. Therefore, they should expect the consequences of going to jail.
Therefore, the court should look at the background of an individual and take it into consideration. And they're unable to do so. The mandatory minimums as applied, particularly with the drug laws, have just...
Judge Simon, let me bring you in for just a moment. And because I respect and love you so, let me ask you a difficult question. We know that you sat as a highly respected judge for, I think, 15 years in Superior Court before you went up to the Appellate Division. Right. Were you ever required to pass a sentence on a person, required by mandatory minimums, to pass a sentence that you thought was excessive and far more than you would have given if you had discretion?
There's no question. By the way, I was not known as a lenient sentencer. I think I was perceived as a pretty tough sentencer. But judges have to have discretion. Let me give you an example. I can remember this case vividly. A guy meets a girl in a bar in a main road in Cherry Hill, Brace Road. It's mostly a commercial road, but 2 blocks in is a school. They go out to the car and they pass a joint of marijuana back and forth. Now, I'm not saying it's right. It's a crime. But that was... Now, if you pass it back and forth, you share with one another. That's distribution. The statute does not say sell. It says distribute. That person distributed within 1,000 feet of school had no idea that 2 blocks in from this bar was a school, and he was subjected to a mandatory minimum. Now, is that fair? First offender. Is that fair? Now,
is that unique, a result that a judge might think unfair or that you thought unfair, or does it happen more often than we should be happy with?
I think what happens more often than we should be happy with are the mandatory periods of parole and eligibility that have other consequences. For example, they disentitle someone, disqualify someone from ISP. Now, everybody knows the ISP program. You can do a whole show on the ISP program, but very few people oppose the ISP program, but the mandatory minimums do it. Look, we have a Code of Criminal Justice that was passed a long time ago. And part of the reason was the perception that, 1, judges were sending people out on the street too quickly, and 2, that there was a gross disparity in sentencing depending upon the county in which a person was sentenced and maybe within the courthouses, within the courtrooms within the various counties.
Judge, let me do something I'll never get to do with you again. Okay. Let me interrupt you for a minute and bring Bob.
You can do it now. I'm retired.
Okay, that's true. No, Bob, are you saying that you've never seen a case in all your experience where you thought the statute was just too severe and that the judge ought to have been allowed to make the judgment?
I think that you're always going to have exceptional cases where there are some factors that may interplay that someone will suggest that the penalty is too harsh. But across the board...
You felt it. You, because I trust you, Judge.
Never,
not once.
I don't think I've seen a case...
Yvonne is shocked.
I know. I don't think I've seen a case where the penalty imposed as required by law was too harsh. I think I've seen judges who've indicated that they would not impose this penalty if they were allowed to have discretion. But the law as applied to this particular crime, a violent crime, the use of the sale of a great amount of drugs, is a crime that should have consequences. And under our law, mandatory minimums are the consequences for those crimes.
The biggest culprit probably is the drug statute. Would you agree to that?
I think that's where we receive the most criticism.
And I think that if you take the judge's scenario and multiply it 1,000-fold, that's what's happened in the state of New Jersey, in the urban centers, in the urban areas where 1,000 feet of a school zone...
So you'll concede that for violent crimes, then, we should have mandatory minimums?
No, I won't concede. No, I won't concede that, because I still think that the judge's discretion to look at the individual's background, prior record, and other factors should be taken into consideration. But certainly with respect to the drug laws, I believe that you would agree that they've been, the majority of the cases fall under that umbrella, would you not?
I would agree that that's where we have the most criticism.
With that, if we take just those laws and look at them, I think would have a significant impact on what the result is.
But we do have to have taken some degree of a look at those there. We have drug court now, where we have allowed individuals who could face the possibility of consequence of mandatory minute to go into that alternative program. So we have taken a look, and we are even looking at it today, how to expand it.
Let me exercise a little discretion and go back to where we started. What are the chances, in your view, that there's going to be any relief for Mr. Cumber?
Oh, I wouldn't want to speculate on that, but I do hope that there is relief.
You wouldn't want to tell us whether you think the arguments are strong or clemency is a possibility?
Well, I think certainly under the facts that his particular case is certainly there's an argument for clemency.
Judge, there's been much criticism of our system and even more of the federal guidelines, which have a similar effect. Any likelihood, in your view, that there will be any changes significantly in the use of mandatory minimums here in New Jersey or nationwide?
I doubt it, and that's because the political process has become what it has become with the sound bites. Can you imagine somebody who votes to repeal mandatory a legislator who votes to repeal mandatory minimums? The next sound bite will be,
okay.
Do you know?
Bob Honecker, you promised to come to due process and tell us when you see a case where there's a sentence
I will be back here for that, Raymond. I will, yes.
And Yvonne, do you see any area, even maybe around the margins of the drug laws, where there might be some changes? You got 10 seconds to answer.
Oh, yeah, I do think. I think that 2C3514, which allows special probation, is going to be re-examined, and we may see more people that will be eligible for alternatives.
You can't talk in numbers. What's that 2C35 thing?
That's the mandatory minimum, the drug statute.
Okay, thank you. That's it for this edition of Due Process, but we'll want you to join us next week for another in-depth look at law and social justice. Until then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
And Robert Marshall, thoughts about him? He's also here in this building, although you wouldn't have the opportunity ever to see him since he's isolated on death row. But surely his is the name in the paper all the time.
Yes.
His are the appeals that keep being considered and reconsidered.
That's right. All mine, I believe all mine, they call me the quiet person or the quiet man. You never hear anything about mine. Just, every time I turn around, they're denied.
And you don't understand why.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,